The words sliced through me like a blade dipped in ice water. "She's just background noise anyway, Marcus. Your mom doesn't really matter in our decisions." I stood frozen in the hallway of my own home, grocery bags heavy in my arms, listening to my daughter-in-law Jessica dismiss my entire existence to my son through their bedroom door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bag slipped from my numb fingers, canned goods rolling. Across the hardwood floor I'd spent 3 days refinishing last month as a surprise for their visit. Background noise? The phrase echoed in my mind as I knelt to gather scattered groceries, my hands trembling not from the weight, but from the casual cruelty of those words. 43 years old, and I'd never felt so invisible, so utterly disposable. My name is Sarah Chen, and until that moment, I thought I understood my place in the world. I was the woman who had raised Marcus as a single mother after his father walked out when he was 7. I was the one who worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, who attended every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every school play where he had 3 lines, and I cheered like he was performing at Broadway. I was the mother who sacrificed dating, friendships, and personal dreams to give my son the stability his father had stolen from us. For 22 years, it had been Marcus and me against the world. When he graduated high school as valedictorian, when he earned a full scholarship to State University, when he landed his first job at a prestigious marketing firm, I felt like we had both succeeded. His victories were my victories because every ounce of my being had been poured into making them possible. Then Jessica entered our lives like a perfectly manicured hurricane, and suddenly I found myself relegated to the sidelines of my own son's existence. Jessica Hartwell came from the kind of family I'd only seen in magazines. Old money, established connections, the type of people who summered in the Hamptons and considered a $20,000 handbag a reasonable investment. She was beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and expensive maintenance, with honey blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, and a smile that could charm anyone into compliance. Marcus had been absolutely smitten from their first date, calling me at 11 at night to gush about this incredible woman he'd met at a company networking event. She was smart, he said, ambitious, sophisticated, everything he'd ever wanted in a partner. I was happy for him, genuinely excited to see my serious, sometimes shy son so animated about someone. The first time he brought Jessica home for dinner, I spent 3 days preparing. I researched her favorite foods, bought the good china ID, been saving for special occasions, even splurged on flowers for the dining room table. I wanted to make a good impression, to welcome the woman who clearly meant so much to my son. Jessica had swept into my modest 3-bedroom house like she was doing me a favor by gracing it with her presence. She complimented my cooking with the kind of polite enthusiasm that felt rehearsed, commented on my quaint decorating choices, and spent most of the evening talking about her family's upcoming charity gala and her position at her father's law firm. When Marcus walked her to her car that night, I watched from the kitchen window as she gestured toward my house while talking to him, her expression suggesting she was discussing something mildly distasteful. I should have recognized the warning signs then, but I was too invested in Marcus's happiness to trust my instincts. The changes started gradually. Marcus began declining my weekly dinner invitations, explaining that Jessica had plans for them, or that they were exploring new restaurants in the city. Our traditional Sunday afternoon phone calls became shorter and less frequent, often interrupted by Jessica needing something or somewhere they had to be. When I did see him, Jessica was usually attached to his arm like an elegant accessory, steering conversations toward topics I couldn't contribute to and people I didn't know. But it was the little things that really carved away at my sense of belonging. The way Jessica would answer Marcus's phone when I called, her voice dripping, with false sweetness as she explained he was busy, the way she'd plan events and trips without consulting me, then act surprised when I mentioned feeling left out. The way she'd correct me when I shared stories about Marcus's childhood, as if my memories were somehow inferior to her opinions. When Marcus proposed to Jessica after dating for 18 months, I learned about it from a Facebook post. Not a phone call, not a visit, not even a text message. A social media announcement featuring a photo of Jessica's massive diamond ring with a caption about how blessed she felt to be marrying her soulmate. I sat in my living room staring at my phone screen, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. Marcus called 3 hours later, his voice rushed and apologetic. "Mom, I'm sorry you had to find out that way. We were so excited we just started posting pictures and I forgot to call you. First. Forgot. As if informing your mother about your engagement was the same as remembering to pick up dry cleaning." The wedding planning process was my introduction to true invisibility. Jessica had very specific visions for her special day, and those visions apparently didn't include input from the groom's mother. I offered to help with flowers, with catering, with any of the 1,000 details that go into planning a wedding. Jessica smiled and thanked me for the offer, but explained that her mother had already arranged everything with their usual vendors. I asked about hosting the rehearsal dinner, a traditional gesture from the groom's family that I'd been looking forward to since Marcus was old enough to understand what marriage meant. Jessica's mother had already booked the country club, Jessica explained, because it would be more convenient for their out-of-town guests. I offered to contribute financially, knowing that my savings account couldn't compete with the Hartwell family budget, but wanting to participate somehow. "They didn't need my money," Jessica assured me with that practiced smile, "but my presence at the wedding would be contribution enough." My presence. As if I were a distant relative instead of the woman who had shaped the man Jessica claimed to love. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of elegant excess, held at a vineyard estate with 300 guests and enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. I watched my son marry the woman he loved while wearing a dress Jessica had approved, sitting in a section reserved for family friends because the front rows were needed for the Hartwell relatives and business associates. During the reception, I spent most of the evening being introduced to people as Marcus's mother, with the same tone one might use to identify the caterer or the photographer. But I told myself it was just wedding stress, that once they settled into married life, things would return to normal. I was wrong. Marcus and Jessica moved into a stunning townhouse in the most expensive part of the city, a wedding gift from her parents that cost more than I'd ever earned in 5 years combined. They furnished it with pieces that had probably been in Jessica's family for generations, creating a space that looked like it belonged in a design magazine, but felt completely foreign to anything Marcus and I had ever shared. My visits became increasingly awkward affairs. Jessica would greet me at the door with air kisses and lead me to their formal living room, the one with the white furniture that seemed to dare anyone to actually sit on it. She'd serve coffee in delicate china cups and make polite conversation about my job at the insurance company, my small garden, my quiet neighborhood, all while somehow managing to make each topic sound quaint and slightly pitiful. Marcus would join us eventually, but even he seemed different in that house. More formal, more careful with his words, as if he were performing a role rather than just being himself. He'd ask about my life with genuine interest, but Jessica would inevitably redirect the conversation toward their upcoming vacation or the dinner party they were hosting for her colleagues or some charity event they were attending. I began to feel like a tourist in my own son's life, welcomed for brief supervised visits but never truly invited to stay. The final blow came 6 months after their wedding, when Marcus called to tell me they'd bought a bigger house. A 4-bedroom, colonial in the suburbs with a pool and a 3-car garage, perfect for the family they were planning to start. I was excited for them, genuinely happy that they were building a life together, until I realized I hadn't been told about the house, hunting, the mortgage application, or any of the decisions that had led to this purchase. "We wanted to surprise you," Marcus explained when I asked why I'd been kept in the dark. But it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like another reminder that I was no longer part of the inner circle where real decisions were made. I helped, Them move, of course. I spent an entire Saturday carrying boxes and arranging furniture, trying to be useful while Jessica directed the professional movers and interior designers she'd hired to handle the important pieces. At the end of the day, she thanked me for my help with the same tone she might use to dismiss a hired assistant. That evening, as I drove home to my empty house with its outdated furniture and family photos that suddenly seemed like relics from another lifetime, I realized that Jessica hadn't just married my son. She'd effectively replaced me as the most important woman in his life, and she'd done it so smoothly that Marcus hadn't even noticed what was happening. The Sunday dinners I'd once shared with Marcus became monthly obligations he fulfilled out of duty rather than desire. He'd arrive alone, explaining that Jessica was visiting her parents or had other commitments, and we'd eat meals that tasted like memory instead of connection. He'd tell me about his job, their travels, their plans for the future. But it all felt secondhand, like he was reporting information rather than sharing his life. I tried to insert myself back into their world through small gestures. I'd send Jessica articles about home decorating that I thought she might enjoy, only to receive polite thank you texts that felt like form letters. I'd offer to babysit when they went out, forgetting that they didn't need my help when they could afford professional services for everything. I'd suggest family traditions we might start together, only to learn that Jessica's family had traditions of their own that took precedence. Every overture was met with courtesy, but no genuine enthusiasm. I was being managed rather than included, tolerated rather than welcomed. The breaking point came on Marcus's birthday, a day that had always been sacred in our small family. For 28 years, I'd made his favorite cake from scratch, a complicated German chocolate recipe that took me most of the day to prepare. It was our tradition, something that belonged to us alone. I called Marcus the week before to confirm our plans, only to learn that Jessica had already organized a surprise party at their country club. 30 of their closest friends, she explained when Marcus put me on speaker. A formal dinner with catering and a professional photographer to capture the memories. It would be such a special celebration. I asked about the cake, about our tradition, about the simple ritual that had connected us for nearly 3 decades. Jessica's laugh tinkled through the phone like broken glass. "Oh, we've already ordered something from the French bakery downtown. Much more sophisticated than homemade, don't you think?" Marcus didn't defend our tradition. He didn't explain to his wife that this cake represented more than dessert, that it was a symbol of all the birthdays we'd celebrated when money was tight, but love was abundant. He just agreed that the professional cake would probably be more impressive for their guests. I attended the party, of course. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wore my best dress and brought an expensive gift, and smiled until my face hurt while watching Jessica play the perfect hostess. The cake was beautiful, an architectural marvel of fondant and edible flowers that looked too precious to eat. When someone asked who had made it, Jessica mentioned the bakery's name with pride, as if she'd accomplished something by spending enough money to buy perfection. Nobody asked about our old tradition. Nobody noticed that I sat quietly in the corner. While Jessica's friends and Marcus's colleagues filled the room with laughter and conversation I couldn't join. Nobody seemed to care that the woman who had celebrated every single one of Marcus's birthdays for 28 years felt like a stranger at her own son's party. That night, lying in my bed and staring at the ceiling, I realized that I'd become exactly what Jessica had called me: background noise. Present but not important, visible but not valued, a minor character in the story of my own son's life. The recognition was devastating, but it was also clarifying. For months, I'd been trying to convince myself that the distance between Marcus and me was temporary, that once the newlywed phase passed, we'd find our way back to each other. But Jessica's dismissive comment had revealed the truth I'd been afraid to acknowledge. I wasn't losing my son gradually. I'd already lost him completely, and I'd been too afraid to admit it. The morning after Marcus's birthday party, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. The hurt was still there, sharp and persistent. But underneath, it was something else. Determination. If I was going to be treated like background noise, if my presence in their lives was truly meaningless, then perhaps it was time to find out what happened when the background went completely silent. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this dismissal went. I needed to know if Marcus was as complicit in my marginalization as his wife, or if he was simply too blinded by love to see what was happening. I needed to know whether there was anything left of the relationship we'd once shared, or if Jessica had successfully erased 22 years of mother-son connection. The opportunity came 2 weeks later when Marcus called to ask if I could house sit while they went to Jessica's parents' anniversary celebration in Martha's Vineyard. They'd be gone for 5 days, he explained, and their security system was complicated. It would be easier if someone was actually staying in the house rather than just checking on it periodically. I agreed immediately, seeing the invitation as a chance to reconnect with my son's world, to understand the life he'd built that seemed to have no room for me. I packed a small bag and drove to their neighborhood, with its perfectly manicured lawns and houses that looked like architectural magazine covers. Their home was even more intimidating when empty. Every surface gleamed with professional cleaning, every room arranged with museum-like precision. There were no personal touches that spoke of Marcus's childhood, no photos of us together, no reminders of the family we'd been before Jessica redefined what family meant. I spent the first day wandering through rooms that felt like a hotel, trying to find traces of my son in this shrine to sophisticated living. His clothes in the walk-in closet were expensive and perfectly pressed, nothing like the thrift store finds and hand-me-downs we'd made work during his growing-up years. His books were gone, replaced by coffee table volumes about art and architecture that looked like they'd never been opened. It was in his home office that I finally found a piece of our shared history. Tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk, underneath warranty cards and instruction manuals, was a photo from his high school graduation. The two of us standing in front of our old house, his arm around my shoulders and both of us grinning like we'd conquered the world together. I sat in his leather desk chair, holding that photo and remembering the day it was taken. How proud I'd been, how excited he'd been about starting college, how certain we'd both felt that we could handle anything as long as we faced it together. Looking at our younger selves, I could barely recognize the people we'd become. That evening, I called Marcus to check in, to let him know everything was fine with the house. Jessica answered his phone, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Sarah, we're at dinner with my parents. Can this wait until tomorrow?" I apologized and started to hang up, but I could hear her talking to Marcus in the background, her voice clearly, audible even though she'd probably intended for me to hear it. "She's so needy, Marcus. Every time we go somewhere, she finds some reason to call. It's like she can't handle being alone for 5 minutes." Marcus's response was too quiet for me to hear, but Jessica's reply came through clearly. "I'm just saying, at some point you need to set boundaries. She's your mother, not your child. She needs to learn to manage her own life without constantly inserting herself into ours." The line went dead, leaving me standing in their pristine kitchen with the phone in my hand and the crushing realization that my son hadn't defended me. He'd listened to his wife dismiss his mother as needy and intrusive, and he'd said nothing. That night, lying in their guest room surrounded by furniture that cost more than my car, I made a decision that would change everything. If Jessica wanted to treat me like background noise, if Marcus was willing to let her erase me from his life, then they were about to learn what real noise sounded like. But first, I needed to understand my enemy. I needed to know who Jessica Hartwell really was beneath her polished exterior, what vulnerabilities might exist behind her confident facade, what weaknesses I could exploit when the time came to make my presence impossible to ignore. I spent the next 3 days conducting the most thorough investigation of my life. I learned that Jessica worked at her father's law firm, Hartwell and Associates, as a junior partner specializing in corporate law. I learned that her position was widely understood to be nepotism rather than merit, that her colleagues resented her privileged status and her tendency to take credit for work she hadn't done. I learned that her father's firm was currently competing for a major contract with the city, a deal that would establish them as the go-to legal team for municipal projects. I learned that this contract was so important to the firm's future that Jessica had been assigned as the primary liaison, her first major independent responsibility. Most importantly, I learned that Jessica's professional reputation was built entirely on her family name and her ability to present herself as polished and competent. But reputation, I realized, was a fragile thing. And if someone knew exactly where to apply pressure, even the most carefully constructed facade could crumble. On my last night in their house, I stood in Marcus's office holding that graduation photo and making a promise to the woman I used to be, the mother who had sacrificed everything for her son, only to be dismissed as background noise. Jessica wanted to erase me from their lives? She wanted to treat me like I was invisible, irrelevant, disposable. She was about to discover that background noise could become a deafening roar when it finally decided to make itself heard. The quiet woman who had spent 2 years accepting scraps of attention from her own son was about to disappear forever. In her place would be someone Jessica had never encountered before, a mother who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. And I was going to start by making some very real noise exactly where Jessica thought she was most untouchable, at her job. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually energized me, but today it carried the weight of purpose that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I had spent the weekend after returning from house-sitting creating what I called my strategic blueprint, a detailed plan that would systematically dismantle Jessica's carefully constructed, professional world piece by methodical piece. My first stop was the downtown library, where I spent hours researching everything I could find about Hartwell and Associates. The firm had been established in 1987 by Jessica's grandfather, built its reputation on municipal contracts and corporate law, and was currently managed by her father, Richard Hartwell. What I discovered in the public records and old newspaper articles painted a picture of a family business that had thrived on connections rather than exceptional legal work. The most interesting discovery came from a series of articles in the Business Journal from 3 years ago. Hartwell and Associates had been investigated for potential conflicts of interest involving city contracts, specifically questions about whether their family connections to city council members had influenced their selection for lucrative municipal projects. The investigation had been quietly dropped, but the whispers of impropriety had apparently never fully disappeared. I printed every article, every public record, every piece of information that might prove useful. Then I drove to the city planning office and spent another 3 hours reviewing the current contract proposal that Jessica was supposedly managing. The proposal was for a 5-year exclusive arrangement to handle all legal work for the city's upcoming downtown revitalization project, worth an estimated $12 million over the contract period. The proposal was impressive, professionally formatted, and filled with the kind of legal language that sounded authoritative to laypeople. But as I read through it carefully, I began to notice inconsistencies. References to ordinances that had been updated since the proposal was written. Citations of cases that didn't seem entirely relevant to municipal law. Small errors that suggested the document had been assembled quickly, rather than crafted with the meticulous attention to detail one would expect from a firm competing for such a significant contract. Most telling was the signature page where Jessica's name appeared as the primary author and contact person. According to the timestamp on the digital files, the proposal had been submitted just 2 weeks ago, right around the time Marcus had mentioned Jessica working late nights to finish an important project. I made copies of everything, my mind already formulating how this information might be useful. Then I drove to the offices of Hartwell and Associates, an imposing glass building in the financial district that screamed old money and established power. I didn't go inside that first day. Instead, I parked across the street and observed. I watched. Employees arrive in the morning, noted the expensive cars in the parking garage, observed the rhythm of a successful law firm conducting its daily business. At 11:30, I saw Jessica emerge from the building with 2 other women, all of them dressed in the kind of tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I followed them at a distance to an upscale restaurant where they were seated at a prominent table near the window. From my position at the bar, I could see Jessica holding court, gesturing animatedly while her companions listened with the kind of attention reserved for someone whose family name opens doors. She looked confident, self-assured, completely comfortable in her role as the privileged daughter who had inherited her position. Watching her in her natural environment, I felt a strange mixture of admiration and disgust. Jessica was undeniably intelligent and articulate, probably capable of being an excellent lawyer under different circumstances. But she had never been forced to prove herself, never had to struggle for recognition or fight for opportunities. Everything had been handed to her, including my son, and she moved through the world with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been truly challenged. That arrogance, I realized, was going to be her downfall. Over the following days, I established a routine of surveillance that would have impressed a private investigator. I learned Jessica's schedule, her habits, her professional relationships. She arrived at the office every morning at 9 sharp, took lunch at the same restaurant 3 days a week, and typically left by 5:30 unless she had evening events or client dinners. More importantly, I learned about her colleagues. Patricia Morrison, a senior associate who had been passed over for partnership twice while Jessica was promoted ahead of her. David Kim, a junior partner who had joined the firm the same year as Jessica, but was still handling smaller cases while she worked on the municipal contract. Robert Chen, no relation despite sharing my last name, a paralegal who had been with the firm for 15 years and knew where every metaphorical body was buried. I began making casual contact with these people, starting with Robert at a coffee shop near the office building. It wasn't difficult to strike up conversations about work stress and office politics. People who feel undervalued are often eager to talk to someone who seems genuinely interested in their frustrations. Robert was particularly forthcoming after I bought him lunch and let him vent about the unfairness of working for a family business where merit mattered less than DNA. Jessica, he confided, was competent but not brilliant, well-connected but not particularly innovative. She had a tendency to claim credit for collaborative work and to blame others when projects encountered problems. The municipal contract proposal, he revealed over our second lunch, had been largely written by Patricia Morrison and David Kim, with Jessica serving as the figurehead who would present it to the city council. This arrangement was typical for the firm, Robert explained, where Jessica's name and family connections opened doors that others couldn't access. But the actual legal work was often done by more experienced attorneys who received little public recognition. Patricia Morrison proved to be an even more valuable source of information, though approaching her required more finesse. I encountered her at a wine bar after work, where she was drinking alone and looking like someone who had reached the end of her professional patience. A few carefully chosen comments about the challenges of being overlooked in male-dominated fields, and Patricia began sharing her frustrations about watching less qualified colleagues advance while her own contributions were minimized. The municipal contract, Patricia revealed with barely concealed bitterness, had been her project from the beginning. She had spent months researching precedents, drafting proposals, and preparing presentations, only to watch Jessica step in at the final stage to take the lead role. Jessica would be the one presenting to the city council. Jessica would receive credit for securing the contract, and Jessica would be positioned for senior partnership while Patricia continued to be treated as valuable but not quite leadership material. David Kim's story was similar but tinged with additional resentment. As the only other junior partner in Jessica's age range, he had expected to be considered for high-profile projects like the municipal contract. Instead, he had been assigned to assist Jessica. essentially serving as her support staff while she claimed the spotlight. The arrangement particularly stung because David's legal expertise exceeded Jessica's in several relevant areas, but his lack of family connections meant his opinions carried less weight in firm meetings. Armed with this intelligence, I began phase 2 of my plan. If Jessica's professional reputation was built on taking credit for others' work while relying on family connections to maintain her position, then the most effective way to damage her would be to expose the gap between her public image and her actual contributions. The first step was anonymous. I spent an evening crafting a detailed email to the city council members who would be voting on the municipal contract. The email, sent from an untraceable account, raised questions about Hartwell & Associates' proposal that I had discovered during my research. I pointed out the outdated ordinance references, the questionable case citations, and the general lack of innovation in their approach compared to other firms competing for the contract. More significantly, I included information about the firm's previous ethics investigation and suggested that the council might want to conduct additional due diligence before awarding such a substantial contract to a firm with unresolved questions about their selection processes. I was careful to present everything as concerned citizen input rather than accusation. But the implications were clear enough for anyone who wanted to read between the lines. The email concluded with a suggestion that the council might benefit from hearing directly from the attorneys who had actually written the proposal, rather than just the family member who would be presenting it. I provided enough specific details about the proposal's contents to demonstrate that this information was coming from someone with inside knowledge. But I was careful not to reveal anything that could be traced back to my conversations with firm employees. 2 days after sending the email, I observed increased activity at Hartwell & Associates. Jessica arrived earlier and stayed later. Meetings ran longer, and there was a general sense of urgency that hadn't been present during my previous surveillance. Through Robert, who had become increasingly willing to share office gossip over our regular coffee meetings, I learned that the city council had requested additional documentation and clarification on several aspects of the proposal. The firm was scrambling to address these unexpected questions, and Jessica was feeling the pressure of being responsible for a project that was suddenly facing scrutiny she hadn't anticipated. Patricia and David were working overtime to revise sections of the proposal, while Jessica attended emergency meetings with her father and other senior partners to discuss strategy for maintaining their competitive position. But this was just the beginning. My anonymous email had created uncertainty, but it hadn't delivered the kind of definitive blow I was planning. For that, I needed to escalate to more direct action. The opportunity came during the firm's monthly networking event, a cocktail party held at an upscale hotel to maintain relationships with clients and court potential new business. I had learned about the event from Patricia, who had mentioned it as an example of the kind of social obligations that came with working at a prestigious firm. I spent 2 hours getting ready that evening, choosing an outfit that would help me blend in with the crowd of successful professionals while projecting the confidence of someone who belonged in their circles. I had purchased a tailored black dress that was expensive enough to look the part, but conservative enough not to draw unwanted attention. My goal was to appear successful, but not memorable, the kind of person who might be someone's wife or business associate without raising questions about why she was there. The hotel ballroom was filled with exactly the kind of people I had expected: lawyers, city officials, business leaders, and their spouses mingling over expensive wine and carefully prepared appetizers. I recognized several faces from newspaper, articles, and city council meetings, including 2 of the council members who would be voting on the municipal contract. Jessica was holding court near the bar, resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than I earned in a month. She was surrounded by a small group of admirers, telling some story that involved animated gestures and frequent laughter. From her audience, she looked completely in her element, confident and charming, and utterly unaware that her world was about to shift beneath her feet. I spent the first hour observing and listening, positioning myself close enough to various conversations to gather intelligence without drawing attention to my presence. The municipal contract was clearly a major topic of discussion, with several people mentioning the recent questions from the city council and speculating about how the competitive process might unfold. Richard Hartwell, Jessica's father, and the firm's managing partner, was working the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been building political relationships for decades. I watched him move from group to group, shaking hands and making small talk, his demeanor suggesting complete confidence in his firm's ability to secure the contract, despite recent complications. Around 9 o'clock, I made my move. I approached Patricia Morrison, who was standing near the buffet table looking like she would rather be anywhere else in the world. Patricia recognized me from our previous encounters at the wine bar, and she seemed relieved to have someone to talk to who understood her frustrations with office politics. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I steered the discussion toward the municipal contract and the stress everyone seemed to be feeling about the city council's unexpected questions. Patricia, emboldened by wine and months of suppressed resentment, began sharing details about the proposal revision process, and Jessica's increasing panic as she realized she couldn't answer technical questions about work she hadn't actually done. As Patricia talked, I noticed David Kim approaching our conversation, apparently drawn by the opportunity to commiserate with someone who shared his frustrations about being overshadowed by Jessica's family connections. Soon, all three of us were engaged in what appeared to be casual networking conversation, but was actually a detailed discussion of Jessica's professional limitations and the firm's questionable practices. The conversation was interrupted when Jessica herself joined our group, her smile bright, but her eyes sharp with the kind of wariness that suggested she sensed undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. She inserted herself into our discussion with practiced social grace, making small talk about the event and asking Patricia and David about their current projects. For several minutes, we engaged in the kind of polite professional conversation that happens at networking events. Jessica was charming and confident, asking intelligent questions and making appropriate responses to Patricia and David's answers. To an outside observer, she would have appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be: a successful young attorney, comfortable with her colleagues and secure in her position. But I was listening more carefully than a casual observer would, noting the places where Jessica's responses revealed gaps in her knowledge about projects she was supposedly supervising. When Patricia mentioned a specific legal precedent that was relevant to the municipal contract, Jessica nodded knowingly, but didn't add any substantive commentary. When David referenced a recent court decision that might affect their proposal strategy, Jessica agreed that it was important to consider, but didn't demonstrate actual familiarity with the case. These were subtle gaps, the kind of thing that might go unnoticed in casual conversation, but would be glaring to anyone who understood the legal work being discussed. More importantly, they confirmed what Patricia and David had already told me about Jessica's tendency to rely on others' expertise while claiming credit for their insights. After about 10 minutes of group conversation, Jessica excused herself to greet other guests, leaving Patricia, David, and me to continue our discussion. As soon as she was out of earshot, David shook his head with barely concealed frustration. "Did you notice how she deflected every technical question? She's been working on this contract for months, supposedly, but she can't discuss the legal details without defaulting to generalities." Patricia nodded grimly. "She's going to present our work to the city council next week, and if they ask specific questions about methodology or precedent analysis, she's going to be completely lost. But somehow, if the contract gets approved, she'll be the one who gets credit for securing it." This was exactly the kind of conversation I had been hoping to facilitate, but I was careful not to push too hard or appear too interested in their complaints. Instead, I made sympathetic noises about the unfairness of workplace politics and the challenges of being overlooked for promotion. As the evening continued, I moved through the crowd making similar observations and having similar conversations. I spoke with a city council member who expressed concern about the recent questions raised about Hartwell and Associates' proposal. I chatted with a representative from a competing law firm, who mentioned rumors about internal conflicts at Hartwell over the municipal contract. I listened to conversations between Jessica's colleagues that revealed ongoing tensions about her leadership style and decision-making process. By the end of the evening, I had gathered enough information to craft the next phase of my plan. More importantly, I had confirmed that Jessica's position was far more vulnerable than she realized. Her professional reputation was built on a foundation of family connections and other people's work, and that foundation was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of increased scrutiny. The following Monday, I implemented the next stage of my strategy. I called the main number for Hartwell & Associates and asked to speak with Jessica about the municipal contract proposal. When her assistant asked who was calling, I identified myself as a representative of Citizens for Government Accountability, a fictional organization that sounded official enough to warrant Jessica's attention. Jessica took the call within 5 minutes, her voice professionally pleasant as she introduced herself and asked how she could help. I explained that our organization was conducting research on municipal contracting processes and had some questions about her firm's proposal for the downtown revitalization project. For the next 20 minutes, I asked Jessica increasingly specific questions about the legal framework supporting her proposal, the research methodology her team had used, and the precedent analysis that justified their recommended approach. I was careful to phrase my questions in ways that sounded like legitimate inquiry rather than hostile interrogation. But each question was designed to expose areas where Jessica's knowledge was superficial or incomplete. Her responses were exactly what I had expected. Jessica was articulate and confident when discussing general principles or high-level strategy, but she became vague and evasive when pressed for specific details about the legal work. She frequently deferred to her team's expertise or promised to follow up with more detailed information. Classic techniques for avoiding questions you can't answer. By the end of the call, I had recorded Jessica making several statements about the proposal that were inconsistent with the actual contents of the document I had reviewed. More significantly, her responses revealed that she didn't understand some of the fundamental legal concepts that formed the basis of her firm's competitive strategy. I thanked Jessica for her time and promised to follow up if we had additional questions. Then I spent the rest of the day transcribing our conversation and preparing a detailed analysis of her responses that highlighted the gaps between her public confidence and her actual knowledge. That analysis became the foundation for my next anonymous communication, this time directed not to the city council, but to the local legal journal that covered municipal law and government contracting. The email, sent from another untraceable account, raised questions about attorney competence in municipal contract proposals and suggested that the journal might want to investigate whether firms were assigning appropriately qualified lawyers to high-stakes public projects. I included specific examples from my conversation with Jessica, though I was careful not to identify her or her firm directly. Instead, I presented the information as concerning trends in municipal contracting that deserved journalistic investigation. I suggested that reporters might want to interview the attorneys actually responsible for writing major proposals, rather than just the family members or senior partners who typically served as public spokespersons. The email was crafted to appeal to journalists' instincts for uncovering stories about nepotism and institutional incompetence, while providing them with a clear direction for investigation. I included enough specific details to demonstrate that this was credible information from an informed source, but I was careful to present everything as questions rather than accusations. 3 days later, a reporter from the legal journal called Hartwell & Associates, requesting an interview with Jessica about municipal contracting practices. According to Robert, who had become my most reliable source of inside information, the why call created immediate panic in the firm's leadership. Jessica was scheduled to present the proposal to the city council in less than a week, and suddenly she was facing the prospect of defending her work to both journalists and government officials. Emergency meetings were scheduled with the firm's senior partners. Patricia and David were pulled into intensive preparation sessions to help Jessica prepare for questions she should have been able to answer independently. The firm's public relations, Consultant was brought in to develop messaging strategies for handling media inquiries about their municipal contracting practices. But the most telling development was Jessica's own response to the pressure. According to Patricia, who was increasingly willing to share her frustrations during our regular coffee meetings, Jessica was beginning to show signs of panic that her carefully maintained professional facade couldn't entirely conceal. She was working longer hours, making more mistakes, and displaying the kind of stress behavior that suggested she was finally realizing how far she was in over her head. The presentation to the City Council was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2:00 in the afternoon. I made sure to be in attendance, positioning myself in the back of the council chambers, where I could observe Jessica's performance without being noticed by anyone from her firm. Jessica arrived early, accompanied by her father and 2 senior associates who were clearly there to provide backup if she encountered questions she couldn't handle. She looked professionally polished in her tailored suit and confident smile, but I could see tension in her posture that suggested she was more nervous than she wanted to appear. The presentation itself was competent, but uninspiring. Jessica read from prepared remarks that covered the key points of their proposal, using the kind of legal language that sounded impressive to laypeople, but lacked the innovative thinking that might distinguish her firm from its competitors. She spoke with authority about concepts that Patricia and David had researched, presenting their work as if it were her own original analysis. For the first 15 minutes, everything proceeded smoothly. Jessica delivered her prepared presentation, without obvious errors, and the council members asked the kind of general questions that she had clearly anticipated and rehearsed. It appeared that she might successfully navigate the presentation without exposing her lack of detailed knowledge about the proposal she was supposedly responsible for creating. Then, Councilwoman Martinez asked a specific question about a recent court decision that had implications for municipal contracting law, a case that I had raised in my anonymous email to the council members. Jessica's response was immediate and confident, but it was also completely wrong. She mischaracterized the court's ruling and offered an interpretation of its implications that revealed fundamental misunderstanding of the legal principles involved. The error was subtle enough that most people in the audience probably didn't recognize it, but I saw Councilwoman Martinez exchange glances with 2 other council members who clearly understood the significance of Jessica's mistake. More importantly, I saw Richard Hartwell's expression shift from confident pride to barely concealed concern as he realized his daughter had just demonstrated her inadequate preparation for this crucial presentation. The questions that followed were increasingly specific and challenging, clearly designed to test Jessica's actual understanding of the proposal, rather than her ability to recite prepared talking points. Jessica's responses became more evasive and less substantive as she struggled to address technical issues that she didn't fully comprehend. By the time the presentation concluded, it was clear that Jessica's performance had raised more questions than it had answered. The council members thanked her for her time with the kind of polite formality that suggested they were far from convinced that Hartwell and Associates was the right choice for such an important contract. As Jessica and her entourage filed out of the council chambers, I could see defeat in their body language despite their attempts to maintain professional composure. They had entered the room expecting to close a major deal, and instead had delivered a performance that highlighted their vulnerabilities rather than their strengths. But this public embarrassment was still only the beginning of Jessica's education about the consequences of treating people like background noise. The real lesson was about to begin when she discovered that the quiet woman she had dismissed as irrelevant was capable of making noise that would echo through every corner of her carefully constructed world. The storm arrived 3 days later, in the form of Jessica Hartwell standing on my doorstep at 6 a.m, her designer clothes wrinkled and her usually perfect hair hanging in unwashed strands around her pale face. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, her eyes rimmed with red and her hands trembling with barely controlled rage. "We need to talk." Her voice was hoarse, stripped of the polished confidence that had once made her so intimidating. "Right now." I stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she moved through my modest living room like a caged animal, her expensive heels clicking against my hardwood floors with sharp, agitated strikes. She turned to face me with an expression of pure hatred that was somehow more honest than any emotion she had ever shown me before. "You destroyed my life." The words came out as an accusation and a question simultaneously, as if she couldn't quite believe that quiet, invisible Sarah Chen had been capable of orchestrating her downfall. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one where I had spent countless evenings reading while Marcus did homework at the kitchen table, and gestured for Jessica to sit down. She remained standing, her posture rigid with fury and desperation. "I think you destroyed your own life, Jessica. I just made sure people noticed." My calm response seemed to infuriate her even more. She began pacing again, her movements becoming more erratic as she struggled to maintain the composure that had always been her greatest weapon. "Don't play innocent with me. I know what you did. The anonymous tips, the fake phone calls, the emails to my colleagues. Marcus showed me everything. You collected about me? Every piece of so-called evidence you used to poison him against me." So Marcus had shared our conversation with his wife, exactly as I had expected he would. The question was whether he had done so out of lingering loyalty to Jessica or because he wanted to force a confrontation that would resolve the conflict between the two women in his life. "Did Marcus also tell you that everything I showed him was true? That you built your entire career on taking credit for other people's work while contributing nothing of substance yourself?" Jessica's composure finally snapped completely. She whirled around to face me, her face contorted with rage that made her look like a stranger wearing her own features. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I worked incredibly hard to build my career, to earn respect in a field dominated by men who look for any excuse to tear successful women down. You took advantage of that environment to destroy everything I'd accomplished." The irony of Jessica claiming to be a victim of sexism while having spent 2 years systematically excluding another woman from her son's life was almost too perfect to believe. But I could see that she genuinely believed her own narrative, that she had convinced herself she was the injured party in this situation. "Jessica, I didn't destroy your career. I simply made sure that the right people knew the truth about your professional competence. If you had actually earned your position through merit instead of family connections, my efforts wouldn't have had any effect." "Merit?" Jessica's laugh was bitter and sharp. "What would you know about merit? You've spent your entire life in the same dead-end job, living in the same pathetic house, never accomplishing anything worth mentioning. You're jealous of everything I've achieved, everything I've built with Marcus." Her words were designed to wound, to remind me of all the ways my life appeared smaller and less impressive than hers. But instead of feeling hurt, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Jessica was finally showing me who she really was beneath. The polished facade, finally revealing the contempt and arrogance that had always lurked behind her practiced smiles. "You're right that my life looks different from yours, Jessica. I never had family money to smooth my path or connections to open doors that merit couldn't unlock. But I raised a son who was capable of love and loyalty and integrity, at least, until you taught him to abandon those values in favor of social climbing and superficial success." "Marcus loves me." The declaration came out as a shriek that revealed how fragile Jessica's confidence in that love had become. "He chose me. He married me. He built a life with me. You're just a bitter old woman who can't accept that your son grew up and moved on." I stood up slowly, drawing myself to my full height and meeting Jessica's gaze with steady calm that seemed to unnerve her more than anger would have. "Marcus loved the person he thought you were, Jessica. But that person never existed. You've been performing a role for 2 years, pretending to be someone worthy of his devotion while systematically isolating him from everyone who might help him see through your act. That's not true. I made Marcus happy. I gave him a life he could be proud of. I elevated him to a social level he never could have reached on his own." Jessica's defense revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed her relationship with my son. To her, Marcus wasn't a partner to be loved and supported. He was a project to be improved and displayed as evidence of her own good taste and social status. You turned my son into an accessory for your lifestyle, Jessica. You trained him to be ashamed of his background, his family, his own values. You didn't elevate Marcus. You diminished him until he was small enough to fit into your narrow definition of acceptability. Before Jessica could respond, we both heard the sound of a key turning in my front door lock. Marcus stepped into the house, looking exhausted and defeated, his eyes moving between his wife and his mother with the kind of weary resignation that suggested he had been dreading this confrontation for days. "I figured I'd find you here," he said to Jessica, his voice flat and emotionless. "You didn't come home last night, and this was the only place I could think to look." Jessica turned to Marcus with desperate hope in her eyes, clearly expecting him to defend her against my accusations and reaffirm his loyalty to their marriage. "Marcus, thank God you're here. Your mother has been saying terrible things about me, making accusations that aren't true. You need to tell her to stop this campaign of harassment before she destroys what's left of my reputation." Marcus looked at his wife with an expression I had never seen before, a combination of sadness and disappointment that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time since they had met. "Jessica, we both know the accusations are true. I've spent the last 3 days going through our entire relationship, remembering conversations and incidents that didn't make sense at the time but are perfectly clear now." Jessica's face went white as she realized that Marcus was not going to rescue her from the consequences of her own actions. "What are you saying? That you believe her lies over your own wife? That you're choosing your mother's jealousy over our marriage?" "I'm saying that I finally understand why my mother disappeared from my life after we got married. I'm saying that I remember now how you used to change the subject whenever I mentioned family dinners or holiday traditions. I'm saying that I know you deliberately scheduled our wedding planning around times when Mom would be working so she couldn't participate." Marcus's words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for months and could no longer contain the pressure of his growing awareness. "You isolated me from my mother so gradually that I didn't notice what was happening until it was too late. You made me complicit in treating the most important person in my life like she was irrelevant to our happiness." Jessica stared at Marcus with growing panic as she realized that her hold over him was slipping away faster than she could repair it. "Marcus, you're not thinking clearly. You're letting your mother manipulate you into doubting everything we've built together. She's trying to destroy our marriage because she can't stand that someone else became the most important woman in your life." "The most important woman in my life?" Marcus's voice rose with anger I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. "Jessica, you made me forget that my mother existed. You turned me into someone who wouldn't even visit his own mother in the hospital because it might interfere with your vacation plans." The reference to an imaginary hospital scenario confused me for a moment, until I realized that Marcus was drawing parallels between Jessica's behavior and the story I had shared with him about prioritizing personal desires over family obligations. He was using metaphor to express his understanding of how completely Jessica had corrupted his sense of priorities. "You didn't just want to be the most important woman in my life, Jessica. You wanted to be the only woman in my life. You systematically erased my mother from our world because you couldn't stand sharing my attention with anyone else." Jessica's desperation was becoming more obvious with each passing moment. She looked between Marcus and me like a trapped animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "That's not what happened. I was trying to help you build an independent adult life, to create boundaries between our marriage and your childhood. Relationships. That's what healthy couples do. Healthy couples don't require one partner to choose between their spouse and their parent," Marcus replied. "Healthy couples find ways to include family members instead of excluding them. Healthy couples build on love and trust instead of manipulation and control. I watched this exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, proud that Marcus was finally standing up for our relationship, but heartbroken that it had taken such extreme measures to open his eyes to Jessica's true nature. Jessica seemed to realize that her usual tactics weren't working, that Marcus was no longer susceptible to her emotional manipulation. She tried a different approach, softening her voice and moving closer to him with the kind of calculated vulnerability that had probably worked on him many times before. Marcus, I know I made mistakes. The stress of building my career, the pressure of trying to fit into your family while establishing our own traditions. I handled things badly sometimes. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work on communication. We can find ways to include your mother in our lives going forward. For a moment, I thought Marcus might be swayed by this seemingly reasonable proposal. Jessica was offering compromise and reconciliation, acknowledging fault while suggesting solutions. It was exactly the kind of mature response that Marcus would want to believe was possible. But then Marcus shook his head with the kind of finality that suggested he had already considered and rejected this possibility. Jessica, it's too late for counseling. You didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to exclude my mother from our wedding planning. You chose to schedule events during times when she couldn't attend. You chose to intercept her phone, calls, and make excuses for why I couldn't see her. You chose to build our marriage on the foundation of erasing the most important relationship in my life. Jessica's mask of reasonableness slipped away, revealing the calculation and entitlement that had always driven her behavior. Fine. You want to choose your mother over your wife? You want to throw away everything we've built together because she couldn't handle being less important than our marriage? Go ahead. But don't expect me to beg for a relationship with someone who's clearly more interested in being a mama's boy than being a husband. The contempt in Jessica's voice was so complete, so dismissive of everything Marcus and I meant to each other, that it finally severed whatever emotional hold she still had over my son. I could see the last threads of his loyalty to her snapping as he realized that she viewed his love for his mother as a character flaw rather than a strength. You still don't understand, do you? Marcus's voice was quiet now, sad rather than angry. This isn't about choosing between you and my mother. This is about choosing between the person I used to be and the person you turned me into. This is about choosing between love and manipulation, between family and social climbing, between integrity and convenience. Jessica realized that she had lost the battle for Marcus's loyalty, but she wasn't ready to concede defeat in the larger war for her own sense of identity and worth. You'll regret this, Marcus. When you're back in this pathetic little house, living your small little life with your small little dreams, you'll remember what it felt like to be married to someone who could elevate you above your circumstances. She turned to me with a final burst of venom that revealed just how much she had always despised everything I represented. And you think you've won something, but all you've done is condemned your son to mediocrity. He could have been something special with me, could have built a life that mattered. Instead, he'll spend the rest of his life taking care of a woman who couldn't even manage to keep her husband around long enough to help raise their child. The reference to Marcus's absent father was designed to wound, to remind me of my failures and inadequacies as a single mother. But instead of feeling hurt, I felt a surge of protective anger that reminded me exactly why I had fought so hard to reclaim my son from Jessica's influence. Jessica, you're right that I couldn't keep Marcus's father around, but I raised Marcus to be a man who would never abandon his family the way his father abandoned us. I raised him to value loyalty and integrity over social status and financial advantage. I raised him to recognize that love means supporting people through difficulties, rather than discarding them when they become inconvenient. I paused, meeting Jessica's gaze with steady confidence that seemed to unnerve her more than anger would have. The fact that you can't understand those values, that you see them as weaknesses instead of strengths, is exactly why you were never worthy of my son's love. Jessica's composure finally collapsed completely. She looked around my living room as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the modest furniture and family photos that told the story of a life built on love rather than money. "This is what you're choosing," she said to Marcus, her voice breaking with frustration and disbelief. "This tiny house, this ordinary life, this woman who never accomplished anything remarkable. This is what you think is worth throwing away our marriage for." Marcus looked around the room too, but his expression was completely different from his wife's. He was seeing the place where he had been loved unconditionally, where he had learned the values that Jessica had spent 2 years trying to erase, where he had always been welcome regardless of his achievements or failures. "Yes," he said simply. "This is what I choose. This is where I belong." Jessica stared at both of us for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions too complex to untangle. Finally, she grabbed her purse from the coffee table where she had dropped it and headed toward the door. "Don't contact me again," she said without turning around. "Either of you. My lawyer will handle the divorce paperwork. I never want to see or speak to anyone from this family again." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and turned back for one final shot. "You could have had everything, Marcus. Instead, you chose nothing." After she left, Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the finality of what had just occurred. The marriage that had dominated his life for 2 years was over, ended not through gradual deterioration, but through sudden, complete recognition of fundamental incompatibility. "Are you okay?" I finally asked, though I could see that the answer was complicated. Marcus considered the question seriously before responding. "I feel like I'm waking up from a very long dream. Not necessarily a bad dream, but one that made me forget who I really was." He looked around the living room with the same nostalgic recognition he had shown earlier, but now his expression held additional elements of regret and lost time. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. For letting her isolate me from you, for not defending you when she made those comments, for becoming someone you probably didn't recognize as your son." I moved from my chair to the couch where Marcus was sitting, taking his hand in mine the way I had when he was small and needed comfort. "You don't need to apologize for being manipulated by someone who was expert at manipulation. Jessica was very good at what she did, Marcus. She made you want to please her, made you believe that her approval was worth more than anyone else's. Love." Marcus squeezed my hand, and I felt 2 years of distance and misunderstanding begin to dissolve between us. "How did you know? How did you figure out what she was doing when I couldn't see it myself?" I thought about how to answer that question honestly without sounding self-congratulatory about my own insight. "Because I loved you first, Marcus. I knew who you really were underneath the person she was trying to turn you into. And because I understood what she was threatened by. Jessica didn't want to share you with anyone, but especially not with a woman who had raised you to value love over status, substance over appearance." We talked for hours that afternoon, rebuilding the connection that Jessica had worked so hard to sever. Marcus told me about the gradual changes he had noticed in himself, the way he had started questioning his own judgment and prioritizing Jessica's preferences over his own instincts. He described the isolation he had felt even within his marriage, the sense that he was performing a role rather than living authentically. I shared my own journey from confusion to hurt to determination, explaining how I had moved from trying to accommodate Jessica's preferences to actively working to expose her manipulation. I told him about the months of research and planning, the strategic decisions that had led to Jessica's professional downfall and personal crisis. "Do you think I'm a terrible person for what I did to her career?" I asked, suddenly needing reassurance that my actions had been justified rather than simply vindictive. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I think you did what you had to do to save our relationship. Jessica wasn't going to change, wasn't going to start including you in our lives, wasn't going to stop trying to erase you. from my world. You fought back the only way that was available to you. His validation meant everything to me, but I still felt the need to acknowledge the complexity of what had occurred. I didn't set out to destroy her marriage to you, Marcus. I was trying to show you who she really was, so you could make an informed choice about your future. The fact that seeing her clearly led you to end the marriage says more about Jessica than it does about my interference. As evening approached, Marcus helped me prepare dinner. Falling back into the comfortable rhythms we had once shared before, Jessica entered our lives. He told me about his plans for the future, his relief at escaping a relationship that had required him to constantly monitor and modify his own behavior to avoid disappointing his wife. I want to rebuild my relationship with you, he said as we cleaned dishes together. I want to remember who I was before Jessica convinced me that my background was something to be ashamed of. I want to be the kind of man you raised me to be, instead of the kind of man she wanted me to become. 3 months later, Marcus filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Jessica didn't contest the proceedings, apparently eager to sever all legal connections to a family she now viewed as beneath her social aspirations. She moved back to her parents' house and eventually found a position at a smaller law firm where her family connections still carried some weight. Marcus moved back into my house temporarily while he searched for his own place, and those months gave us the opportunity to fully repair the damage that Jessica's manipulation had caused to our relationships. We established new traditions and routines that honored our history, while acknowledging that Marcus was now an adult with his own life to build. The house felt alive again with Marcus's presence, filled with conversation and laughter instead of the silence that had marked my loneliness during his marriage. We cooked meals together, watched movies, talked about books and current events and future plans. Slowly, the son I had raised emerged from underneath the stranger Jessica had created. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Marcus met Elena, a teacher at a local elementary school who shared his values and appreciated his close relationship with his mother. When he brought her to meet me, I could see immediately that this woman understood the importance of family connections, rather than viewing them as competition for Marcus's attention. Elena asked thoughtful questions about Marcus's childhood, listened to our family stories with genuine interest, and made it clear that she wanted to build on our existing relationship rather than replace it. She invited me to participate in their wedding planning from the beginning, asking for my input on everything from flowers to music to menu choices. Their wedding was everything Jessica's had not been: intimate, personal, focused on love and commitment rather than social display. I sat in the front row, wearing a dress Elena had helped me choose, watching my son marry a woman who had embraced our family instead of trying to recreate it in her own image. During the reception, Marcus stood up to make a toast that brought tears to my eyes and validation to every choice I had made during those difficult months when I had fought to reclaim my son. "I want to thank my mother," he said, looking directly at me with love and gratitude that made every moment of pain worthwhile. She taught me that real love doesn't require you to choose between the people you care about. She showed me that family means supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning each other when things get complicated. She reminded me that becoming an adult doesn't mean forgetting where you came from or who helped you become the person you are. He raised his glass in my direction, and the entire room followed his gesture. "Mom, thank you for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on our relationship. Thank you for fighting for us when I was too blind to fight for myself. Thank you for teaching me the difference between love that builds up and love that tears down." As I sat in that room surrounded by people who truly cared about Marcus and appreciated the role I had played in shaping the man he had become, I thought about Jessica's parting words about choosing nothing over everything. She had been wrong, of course. I hadn't chosen nothing. I had chosen love over status, authenticity over performance, family over social climbing. Jessica had offered Marcus a life that looked impressive from the outside but was hollow at its core. Elena was offering him a life that might appear more modest, but was rich with genuine connection and shared values. The difference between those two options wasn't about choosing nothing over everything. It was about choosing what mattered over what merely looked good. 2 years later, when Elena gave birth to my first grandchild, I was in the delivery room holding her hand while Marcus cut the umbilical cord. As I looked at this tiny person, who would grow up knowing unconditional love from both parents and extended family, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning, and everything to do with preserving something precious that had almost been lost. Jessica had called me background noise, dismissing my importance in Marcus's life with casual cruelty that revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what family means. But background noise, I had learned, could become the dominant sound when it chose to make itself heard. And sometimes, making noise was the only way to save the people you loved from losing themselves in someone else's silence. 5 years have passed since that morning when Jessica stood in my living room, her world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a windstorm. Today, I'm sitting in my garden, watching my 3-year-old granddaughter Emma chase butterflies between the rose bushes I planted the year she was born. Her laughter fills the air with pure joy, and I marvel at how completely my life has transformed. Elena calls from the kitchen window, asking if Emma and I want lunch on the patio. My daughter-in-law has become more than I ever dared hope for in Marcus's partner. She values our family traditions while creating new ones, includes me in decisions, while respecting their independence as a couple, and treats me like the grandmother Emma deserves rather than an obligation to be managed. Marcus emerges from the house carrying a tray of sandwiches, his face relaxed in a way it never was during his marriage to Jessica. He's found his way back to himself, the man I raised him to be, someone who can balance love for his family with commitment to his wife and daughter. Watching him with Emma, seeing the patience and tenderness he shows her, I know that the lessons he learned about unconditional love weren't lost forever in Jessica's manipulation. "Grammy, look what I found." Emma runs toward me holding a small rock that she's convinced is a treasure. I examine it with the serious attention it deserves, praising her discovery while she beams with pride. These are the moments I almost lost. The simple family interactions that Jessica tried to convince Marcus were unimportant. Elena sits beside me on the garden bench we built together last spring. She's pregnant again, though we haven't told Emma yet. The baby is due in December, and Marcus has already started preparing the nursery with the same careful attention he once gave to impressing Jessica's friends. "Sarah, I got a call from my principal today," Elena says, her voice carrying excitement. The school board approved my proposal for the family literacy program. They want to implement it district-wide starting in the fall. I feel genuine pride in Elena's achievement, the kind of professional success that comes from hard work and dedication rather than family connections or political maneuvering. She spent months developing a program to help parents support their children's education, drawing on her own experiences growing up in a family that valued learning above status. Marcus joins our conversation, describing his recent promotion to senior marketing director at a firm that values creativity and integrity over social connections. He's built a career based on his own merits, working with people who appreciate his authentic personality rather than expecting him to perform a role that never fit. "I ran into Patricia Morrison at the coffee shop downtown last week," Marcus mentions casually. "She said Jessica got married again to some investment banker her father introduced her to. Apparently they're living in New York now." The news about Jessica doesn't sting the way it might have years ago. I hope she's found happiness with someone who appreciates the person she actually is rather than the person she pretends to be. Everyone deserves love, even people who make destructive choices when they're afraid of being seen as inadequate. Elena reaches over to squeeze my hand. I'm glad things worked out the way they did. I can't imagine Marcus without his close relationship with you. Emma wouldn't be the same person without her grandmother's influence. Looking at my granddaughter, watching her confident exploration of the world around her. I see the continuation of values that Jessica tried to erase. Emma will grow up knowing that love doesn't require choosing sides, that family means supporting each other through difficulties, that success means living according to your principles rather than other people's expectations. The afternoon sun is beginning to set, casting golden light across the garden that has become our family's gathering place. Marcus starts preparing the grill for dinner while Elena helps Emma collect flowers for a bouquet. I sit quietly, absorbing the sounds and sights of a life rebuilt on authentic foundations. There are moments when I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, lonely and dismissed, watching my son disappear into someone else's vision of who he should be. That version of myself feels like a character from someone else's story, a person I barely recognize despite sharing her memories. The transformation wasn't easy or quick. There were months of doubt, wondering if my actions had been justified or simply vindictive. There were times when I questioned whether destroying Jessica's career had been necessary, or if I could have found another way to reclaim my relationship with Marcus. But watching Emma help her father arrange charcoal in the grill, seeing the easy affection between Marcus and Elena, witnessing the kind of family dynamics that Jessica's control would have made impossible, I know that every difficult choice was worth making. Marcus has learned to recognize manipulation disguised as love, to value substance over appearance, to choose authenticity over convenience. Elena has learned our family's history and chosen to honor it while adding her own chapters. Emma is growing up surrounded by people who see love as something that multiplies rather than divides when it's shared. The phone rings inside the house, and Marcus goes to answer it. He returns a few minutes later with news that makes my heart skip with unexpected joy. That was Robert Chen. Remember him from Jessica's old firm? He wanted to let us know that Hartwell and Associates lost their appeal for the municipal contract. The city decided to award it to a smaller firm that specializes in community-focused development. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with dramatic fanfare. Sometimes it unfolds quietly over years, revealing itself through the natural consequences of choices people make when they think nobody is watching. Elena starts setting the patio table while Emma arranges her flower bouquet in a small vase. Marcus lights the grill and begins preparing the vegetables we grew together in the garden patch he helped me expand. These simple domestic rhythms represent everything Jessica dismissed as ordinary and everything I fought to preserve. As we gather around the table for dinner, Marcus asks Emma to tell us about her day at preschool. She launches into an animated account of finger painting and story time, her enthusiasm infectious and her confidence unshakable. She's growing up knowing that her voice matters, that her experiences are valued, that love is something to be celebrated rather than rationed. "Grammy, will you read me a story before bed?" Emma asks as Elena begins clearing dishes. "Of course, sweetheart. Which book would you like tonight?" "The one about the little girl who plants a garden and watches it grow." It's a new book Elena bought last week, about patience and nurturing, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful through consistent care. As I follow Emma inside to begin our bedtime routine, I think about how perfectly the story's themes match the reality of our rebuilt family. Later, after Emma is asleep and Marcus and Elena have gone to their own home down the street, I sit on my front porch with a cup of tea and reflect on the journey that brought me to this peaceful evening. The woman who once felt invisible and irrelevant has become the cornerstone of a family that values her presence and wisdom. Jessica was wrong about many things, but perhaps most significantly about the nature of background noise. She thought dismissing me would make me disappear, that treating me as unimportant would actually render me powerless. Instead, she learned that background noise can become a symphony when it decides to claim its rightful place in the composition. My story isn't unique in its broad outline. Many parents watch their adult children get pulled away by partners who see family connections as competition rather than blessing. Many mothers find themselves marginalized by daughters-in-law who view love as a zero-sum game. Many families discover that sometimes you have to fight to preserve relationships that seem destined to be taken for granted. But every story is unique in its details, in the specific choices people make when confronted with the decision between convenience and courage. I chose to fight for my relationship with Marcus not because I wanted to control his life, but because I wanted him to remember who he was before someone else redefined him. The night air carries the scent of jasmine from the vine Elena and I planted along the fence. Tomorrow, Marcus will stop by after work to help me repair the garden gate. This weekend, we're planning a barbecue to celebrate Elena's promotion and Emma's upcoming 4th birthday. Next month, we'll start preparing for the new baby's arrival. These are the rewards of refusing to accept dismissal, of insisting that love means inclusion rather than exclusion, of believing that family bonds are worth fighting to preserve. Jessica called me background noise, but I became the melody that helped my son find his way back to himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.